Welcome back, everyone, to another week of Ramban al Parsha. This week, in addition to Purim, so I wonder when you'll have a chance to see this, if at all, we have the great zchut of reading Tisa. And Tisa is too important to the back end of Shmos to skip, so we'll do our best. Maybe we'll make it a little shorter today, because again, I think people are pretty pressed for time this week. The main story in Tisa, obviously, is the Chet Egel. And we've talked in the past about where exactly it comes chronologically. But let's talk today about something much more substantive, and that is, what was the sin of Chet Egel? So I think most people would say it's a sin of Avodah Zarah. And the Ramban disagrees, and it's worth it to see it inside, because it's also worth it to ask the question of, does the Ramban change his mind over time? Does he start with one position and sort of along the way convince himself of another? So if we go to Perek Lamed Bet, the Pasuk says, Vayara am ki voshesh Moshe laredet min hahar. The people saw that Moshe was delayed in coming down from the mountain. Vayikahel ha'am al haron vayamur elav kum aselanu Elohim asher yelchu lefanenu ki zeh Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elanu me'eretz Yisrael lo yadanu mehayalo. They turn to Aaron and they say, we need a replacement. We don't know what happened to Moshe. Okay, that's the line that the Ramban is going to discuss. So after quoting Rashi, the Ramban says as follows: Ve'en l'shano mechuvan. I think Rashi's wrong when he talks about elokut harbe ivolahem. They tried many different gods. No. Aval hakatuv hazehu mafteach ladat inyan ha'egel umachshevet osav. Says the Ramban, this line is the key to understanding the story of the Egel. Ki biyadua, says the Ramban, and the way he does it, it's so beautiful when he does this. The Ramban is convinced of something. Textual proofs, he doesn't need it. Ki biyadua shelo hayu Yisrael sivurim shemosha hu ha'elokim v'shehu b'kocho asalahem ha'utot v'hamoftim. Says the Ramban, there's no way that the Jewish people confused Moshe Rabbeinu with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No way. And again, you could say the Ramban was influenced in this by the Christian polemics and the people he had to deal with. But says the Ramban, that's not a mistake that a Jew could make. That a human being, that a basar v'dam could be God. Uma tam she'omru kevan shalach Moshe mimenu na'aseh Elokim. There is a God. He's not Moshe. Why would they want to replace Moshe with a God? Va'od ki b'feirush amru Elohim asher yelchu lefanenu. Lo sheyihiyu notnim lahem chayim ba'olam hazeh o ba'olam haba. He's a God, quote unquote, who's going to walk in front of them. So what were they looking for? So says the Ramban, it wasn't Avodah Zarah. They weren't looking to replace HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God forbid. The Ramban doesn't say this, but obviously they're still at Har Sinai. It's literally 40 days after the greatest Gilui Shechina in the history of the world. There's no way they want to replace God, says the Ramban. No. Aval hayu mivakshim Moshe acher. They were looking for a replacement for Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, what was Moshe Rabbeinu for them? Amru, Moshe shahore lanu haderech mimitzrayim ve'adheina. Right, Moshe told us where to go. Shayu hamasaim al pi Hashem biyad Moshe. God told Moshe, and Moshe told them, Hine avad mimenu. He's lost. Na'aseh lanu Moshe acher sheyoreh haderech lefanenu al pi Hashem biyado. We need another intermediary. We need something who's going to interpret what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us. Literally, in a non-literal sense, they wanted a new ways. They needed directions in the midbar. Says the Ramban, it wasn't Avodah Zarah. They weren't trying to get rid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God forbid. They simply needed to know whether they make a right or left in 100 meters, or 100 yards, or 100 feet, depending on whatever ways you have. Literally, that's what they wanted. V'zetam hizkiram Moshe ha'ish asher ha'elanu. Lo hakel asher ha'elam. Right? Literally, Moshe brought them out. Ki yitztarchu le'ish Elokim. V'chein tuchal lahavin zeh mitshuvat Aaron al Moshe Rabbeinu. And it was Aaron's answer was, when Moshe says to Aaron, Me'asa lecha ha'am hazeh, ki heveita alav chata'a gidolah. How do you do such a terrible thing? V'haitat shuvato. And Aaron answered, Vayomu lo kum aselanu Elohim v'amar lahem lemi zahav hitparaku vayitnu li va'ashlicheu ba'esh V'hinei Aharon mitnatzel Moshe v'omer lo al yicharaf Adoni v'hu kimosif al chatato pesha. Right, when you read just the simple psukim, Aaron's saying to Moshe, don't be angry at me, but then he says, I did this avodah zarah, I did this terrible thing, so what's going on? Shomer ki heim bikshu mimenu avodat gilulim va'asa lahem biyadav v'lama lo yicharaf ho. Why wouldn't Moshe be angry at them, at Aaron, if the Jewish people came to Aaron and said, we need an avodah zarah to replace God, and Aaron made one? Uma chata agidolom is, what could be a bigger sin? Says Ramban, but that's not what happened. Aval ha'inyan kemo she'amarti shelo bikshu ha'egel lihiyot lahem lakel meimitu mechayeh. They weren't looking for a God. They weren't looking for somebody who gives life and takes life. V'kiblu avodat elokut alehem. Aval yirtzu sheyihiyeh lahem b'makom Moshe mored darkam. They wanted somebody to take Moshe's place as the navigator, as the person who understands and who can tell them what God wants of them. That's what Aaron was saying when he answered Moshe. Ta'an kilo amruli rak she'eselohem Elohim asher yelchu lifnehem bimkomcha Adoni shelo yadu mahayalacha. They weren't looking for a God, says Aaron. They were just looking for a replacement for you, Moshe. And that's what I gave them. Vim tashuvim lo. Right? If you're not going to come back, then this entity will do the job. And if you do come back, they'll throw it out. V'lachein. Heim hayu tzrichim lemi she'oreh lahem darkam kol zman shelo tiyat ta'imahem. If you're not going to be there, they need somebody to give them directions. V'imulai tashuv ya'azveyu v'yelchu acharecha kiva rishona. Okay, so then if you come back, great. They'll throw it out. V'chein, says the Ramban, and this is really, I think, the strongest proof. V'chein haya hadavar, ki kevan shera'u ha'amet Moshe. When Moshe came down and immediately announced himself, miyad hinichu et ha'egel uvo'atu bo, shehinichu lo l'sarfo. No one objected to Moshe Rabbeinu burning the Egel and scattering the ashes. No one objected. V'lo hayamahem cholek alav klal. Right? No one disagreed with Moshe. V'chein tireh shelo hochicham v'lo amar lohem klum, aval b'vo'o b'machaneh vayar ta'egel u'mecholot miyad barchu mimenu. The people ran away because they were so embarrassed for what they had done. V'hu lakach ha'egel vayisrof oto vayishak oto lohem v'lo me'anu klal. No one objected. No one resisted even. And now says the Ramban, V'ilu hayalahem leilokim. If they actually intended the Egel to be their own real God, ein derech she'aniach adam malko ve'elokav l'sreifat eish. If it was really the God, if the Egel HaZahav was really their God, they wouldn't have just allowed Moshe to destroy it in front of them. Right, that's the pasuk. Could you possibly burn their gods and they won't fight us? The Egyptians won't kill us if we slaughter their gods? Of course they will. So, at this point, the Ramban says as follows, right? And we know this already, that Chet HaEgel wasn't Avodah Zarah. They came to Aaron and they said, Kum aseh lanu Elohim asher elchu lefanenu. Please make us an intermediary. Please make us a ways. Make us something that's going to let us know where God wants us to go. Okay, and that's what Aaron did. And when Moshe came down and they saw that Moshe was alive, they immediately abandoned the idea. Because what's the point? They don't need another Moshe if Moshe is alive. They were perfectly happy to follow Moshe. Right? We need to sort of adjust our view of the Chet HaEgel and what we've always thought, from making it the biggest tragedy in the world to making it something less than that. And now something less than that is still serious, presumably. But I think then, if you follow the Ramban, the question then becomes, why is Moshe Rabbeinu so angry at them? And why is HaKadosh Baruch Hu so angry at them? Okay, it's a sin to try to replace Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu, they had to wait for him, and they should have waited for him. But okay, that you're going to keep them in the midbar forever. You're not going to let them go into Eretz Yisrael, right? I think that's the strongest question on the Ramban. If the sin didn't involve Avodah Zarah, So why was it such a terrible sin? And why did Chazal say that every time we're punished going forward, we're going to be punished in some way for the Chet HaEgel? And why did Moshe Rabbeinu, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu want to destroy Klal Yisrael? These are strong questions on the Ramban. And I think it's possible that the Ramban's position softens. Right now he's saying, no intention whatsoever of worshiping Avodah Zarah. The sin was they wanted to replace Moshe Rabbeinu. It's even hard to know what Aveira that would be. It's a lack of belief in Moshe. It's hard to know. Like, why is that such a terrible thing? But then, the Torah goes on. And in Pasuk Dal, the Torah says, Vayikach miyadam, Aaron takes the gold from them, Vayatzar ato bacheret vayaseu egel masecha, right? And he makes it into an egel. Vayomru, Eila Elohecha Yisrael asher ha'alucha me'eretz Mitzrayim. So the Ramban is very interested in the difference between ha'alucha and ha'alanu. Ramban thinks if it was real, the people would have said, this is the God who took us out of Mitzrayim. Not Asher ha'alucha, that took you out, but who took us out. But Aaron avoids that. And in Pasuk Dalet in the Ramban makes a big deal out of the fact that he says Asher ha'alucha instead of ha'alanu. It could be that Aaron's separating himself from the people, but he also starts to weaken in his position. Ki yikchu zeh b'makom hayad ha'gidola ha'marchevet yam ha'shemesh me'imkei yam derech la'avor gi'ulim v'zeu she'amar vayamiru et kvodam b'tavnit shar ochel esav. All of a sudden, it's not just a ways, it's something more. It's something more significant. V'sham ne'amar shachachu el moshiam oseh gidolot b'mitzrayim niflaot ba'aretz Ba'aretz cham noraot al yamsuf. Shachechu divaro asher tzivam. V'hinei avru alo sa'aseh lecha Elohim achrim al panai kasher ramazti sham v'tavin zeh. The details are hard to parse through. But here the Ramban is saying, no, the Aveira that they committed is an Aveira of Avodah Zarah. Maybe it's not worshipping an Avodah Zarah, but it's certainly creating an Avodah Zarah. And my feeling is there's one more Ramban that kind of seals the deal. The next Ramban in Pasuk Hey says, Vayar Aharon, Ta'am zeh hakatuv, shera'a otam bira, mechavnim el ha'egel. They intended to worship the Egel, v'kam uvana mizbech, and he built his own mizbech, v'kara chag lashem machar. Sheyizbechu lashem hamiyuchad al hamizbech asher banahu lishmo. That they should worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You want to have an intermediary? Fine, I'll make that for you. But I'm not making another God. We worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'lo yivnu he mizbechot leboshet pneihem. They won't build their own mizbechot to Avodah Zarah. But at this point, it seems like they want to worship Avodah Zarah. V'yitachen shamar machal laharich lahem. He wanted to push them off. Ula yavom Moshe v'yazov ta'egel. V'heim hishkimu baboker v'yalu olot v'yagishu shlamim. V'lo amar hakatuv v'yalu lo olot v'yagishu lo shlamim. It doesn't say that they did it to Avodah Zarah. V'ha'inyan mipnei shayu behen mechavnim l'shem HaKadosh Baruch Hu kasher amar Aaron u'mehem mashchitim v'zovchim la'egel. Says the Ramban, there were really two groups. There were the people who the Ramban describes in the first Ramban that we did, who wanted a replacement from Moshe Rabbeinu, who wanted a new ways, a new navigational tool. But then there were people who turned the navigational tool that Aaron made into a god. Ve'al eila amar kadosh baruch hu Moshe vayishtachavu lo vayizbechu lo ki heim hachotim. V'mulai haya Aaron hamakriv karbonot amar stam vayalu olot vayagishu shlamim ki hu mechaven l'Hashem Hashem v'heim da'atam el ha'egel asher asu v'hayu ha'ba'alim mefaglim. They were making pigul. So if we put the three Rambans together, here's what I think. I think the Ramban meant it at the beginning, which is when they came to Aaron, and they said, we need a God, asher yelchu lefanenu, they meant an intermediary. God forbid, they didn't mean to replace HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They knew that this ox didn't take them out of Egypt. They knew that completely. However, once there was a golden calf, once there was this ox, and once there was this Mizbeach, people found it easy to worship them. Not all of them, and maybe not even most of them. But once there is an intermediary, and it's not Moshe Rabbeinu, that puts the Jewish people at risk. And it reminds me very, very much, there's no reason to think that the Ramban had this in front of him or thought it was the same thing, but the Rambam in the first parak of Hilchos Avodah Zarah has a very similar idea. It's in a different context. The Rambam there asks, wait, didn't Adam HaRishon knew God? How could his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren worship Avodah Zarah? Why didn't Adam HaRishon just say to them, there's a God, you have to worship that God? So the Rambam explains it. Bimei enosh ta'u b'nei ha'adam ta'ud gadol. V'nivara atzad chachmei oto hador ve'enosh atzmo min ha'to'im haya. What was the mistake? V'zeh hayot ta'utam. Amru. Ho'il v'ha'elokim bara kochavim elu v'galgalim lahanhiget ha'olam. Since God himself made the sun and the moon and the stars, unitanam b'maram, and he put them in heaven. V'chalak lahem kavod, and he gave them honor. V'hem shamashim hamishamshim lefanav. They worship God. Re'uyim heim l'shabcham u'lefa'aram v'lachlok lahem kavod. It makes sense, says Enosh to his generation mates. God gives tribute to these planets and to the stars. We should worship them also, not as a form of avodah zarah, not as a form of rebellion, but it's hard to worship a God that you can't see and there's no tangible proof of. But if God gave power to the sun and the moon and the stars to rule nature, we should worship them as representatives of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that was their mistake. It was a small mistake, but it was a mistake because they're still worshiping God. But once you start worshiping intermediaries, says the Rambam later on, disaster comes. Then false prophets come and they say, no. There's no God. The sun is a God. The moon is a God. The star, they have independent authority. And you forget about God and you worship them, and that's how Avodah Zarah enters the world. And I think the Ramban is saying something very, very similar here. On the one hand, the Jewish people were not replacing God whatsoever. They knew who God was, and they knew who Moshe Rabbeinu was, and they didn't confuse the two at all. And they were really asking Aaron for a replacement for Moshe Rabbeinu, someone who would direct them properly in the Midbar and get them to Eretz Yisrael. But the second that intermediary existed, a group of Jews, not all of the Jews, but a group of Jews misunderstood. And they worshipped that intermediary as if it was God, as if it had independent power, as if it had authority, as if it made a difference in the world. And that doesn't border on Avodah Zarah, that is Avodah Zarah. And says the Ramban, in the end, there were people who immediately understood that this is just an intermediary, and there are people who misunderstood. And that's where the great anger came from. Literally, that's where HaKadosh Baruch Hu couldn't take it anymore, and Moshe couldn't take it, and Aaron couldn't take it. When they started bringing karbanot, not to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Aaron had planned, but to the Egel HaZahav, that was more than anybody could take. That's where the anger came from. That's where the punishment came from. Yes, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgave us for the Chet HaEgel, but he never really forgave us completely. And that's the medrash that I mentioned before, that we're constantly going to be punished for the Chet HaEgel, that it was always part of it. And the sense you get, even in the Ramban, is that this kind of was the end. Meaning, you sort of know at this point, it'll be hard to march directly into Eretz Yisrael. And, you don't know what's going to go wrong, and you can't really plan on the Chet HaMeraglim, which is the next big Aver that happens in the Torah. But, the sense you get is that God's forgiving us, but not completely so. And that maybe, if it wasn't the Chet HaMeraglim, it would have to be something else that would have kept us out of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, but the bottom line is, and we'll stop here, it'll be a short week. The bottom line is, says the Ramban, the original plan was to make a new intermediary to replace Moshe Rabbeinu. It doesn't make any sense that people would think that the Egel HaZahav took them out of Egypt. They saw Aaron making it. It doesn't make any sense. But then, once it existed, much like, I think, the Rambam in the first parak of Hilchos Avodah Zarah, people misunderstood and people took it for something more than it was. Again, some of the Jews, not all of them, but that's where the anger came from, and that's where the great punishment came from. Okay? Yashkach to everybody. Purim Sameach. Shabbat Shalom. And see you next week for a full version of the Ramban al Parsha. Bye-bye.